Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Welcome back to ISU Dairy News and Views, the podcast where we bring you timely topics to help your dairy thrive. So whether you're on the farm today, in the barn, or on the road, we're glad you're tuning in. I'm Jennifer Bentley, Dairy Field Specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And today we're going to be talking about one of those most critical management areas, the calving pen, and particularly around calving with heifers and getting them set up for success as they enter into their first lactation. We know that they're the future of our herd, but they also present some unique challenges during that transition period. So we wanted to bring on our guest, Dr. Howard Tyler with Iowa State University, as he's going to share some practical strategies to reduce heifer stress, improve calving outcomes, and set both the heifers and those fresh cows up for success. I also have on the podcast here today Dr. Philip Jardin, our extension veterinarian with ISU Extension and Outreach. So want to welcome both of you to our podcast here today.
Thanks, Jen.
Yep. Thank you, Jen. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I wanted to have you both on this topic because we know that calving and that transition management is a pretty particular area as far as getting those heifers set up for success right away. And there's a lot of things that we can do ahead of calving to make that a successful transition. So Howard, as we kind of start with this bigger picture of calving pen readiness, why is calving pen readiness such a high stakes issue for our dairy producers?
Probably most importantly, because there's a cost associated with not doing it well. I think that's what hits people first, is if it hits you in the pocketbook, then it's important. And this does have significant costs associated with it. So for every cow or heifer that experiences dystocia, there's approximately a $1,500 loss associated with that. So the other part is you can change that. So economic losses hurt, but especially when they're not, when they're preventable, and these are preventable losses for the most part. So we can significantly increase farm income by doing this well.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things we don't realize that we can change until we start seeing issues with dystocia or retained placenta, those types of issues later on, right? That, oh, maybe if we had done some things differently ahead of
Yeah.
that would have changed the course.
And I think that also because farms tend to have a baseline level of problems in their herd, you see them as normal. And just because it's typical doesn't mean it's normal. Because it's happening in your herd doesn't mean it's not preventable. And I think that's a hard mindset to get into. Having farmed in the past myself, I can look back and see a lot of things that weren't normal that were happening in the herds I was managing. But at the time, it all seemed that way because that was just how it had always been. So aiming for what could be instead of what is I think something that we should all be striving towards in the work that we do, and especially on farms, is always striving to be better around the margins, and especially in things that, like I say, this has a pretty significant cost that we can recover if we change that. Some things we can change and it's pretty marginal improvement in profit, but this can have a really significant impact on the bottom line.
Do you have an opinion on the group changes on cows as they move from far off to close up and so on, and how big those groups should be, or how many different diets should be there, and think about the social aspect of the animals too?
Yes, and I think that's the hard part of this, Phil, is because there's always a conflict between what's best socially for the animal, what's best nutritionally for the animal, what's best from a farm efficiency and labor efficiency standpoint. So we're going to sacrifice some labor efficiency to gain more profit on the other end. It seems counterintuitive sometimes to spend more money to make more money, right? And um, so the number of pen changes are really impactful. I think it helps me to think about this. I don't know why. It always helps me to think about this from a human standpoint. Um, if you had a young woman delivering her first baby, I think the last thing we would do is, well, we do a lot of things for them to prepare them for that experience, right? They go to the hospital, they tour the birthing room, they take their partner along. They've got all sorts of things that we do that aren't medically necessary, but just from a stress level standpoint, they help reduce stress of that experience for that person going through it the first time. But we don't do any of that for the heifer. Well, sometimes it's the equivalent of taking them and being like, well, she's in labor. We're going to throw her in the ambulance, turn on the sirens, run her to a place they've never been with people they've never seen. And it's an incredibly stressful experience. And then we expect it to go well. And it doesn't. So we shouldn't be shocked that dystocia incidence is as high as it is because we aren't necessarily intentional about reducing the stress associated with that.
And Howard, I know during the webinar that we did on this, you talked a little bit about heifer behavior during stage 1 and stage 2 labor and how that differs from cows. Can you just describe that a little bit here?
Yeah. So, and again, some of this is maybe not normal, but it's typical again. So, heifers go into labor early, or they're in stage 2 labor longer than cows. So we say they go into labor earlier, but they're just in labor longer. And part of that is, again, because of the novelty of the experience and the novelty of their surroundings. And so we can reduce how much that is by, again, being intentional in how we expose them to some of those things ahead of time. But typically, then or heifers will be in stage 2 labor longer. They're more restless during labor, so they're up and down more frequently. Um, stage that final stages of labor are harder. Cortisol levels are higher. Really, a lot of this is all about cortisol, Jen. Cortisol is really important through the calving process for a normal calving to occur, but excessive cortisol is incredibly detrimental. And so we're not trying to eliminate cortisol levels by any means, but we're trying to keep them at what normal levels should be and normal changes should be. And for heifers in particular, um, those higher cortisol levels reflect in more restlessness, um, longer labors. If they get interrupted, it takes them longer to go back into active labor. We know from some of our work that if we interrupt cows during labor and move them like a just-in-time calving, but a stressful just-in-time calving, cows will come in back into labor within an hour. Sometimes they're fine with it because they've been through this before and they kind of know what's happening and they're familiar with you and the surroundings. Heifers, we do the exact same thing. And on average, with our stressful just-in-time calving intervention, they were out of labor for 16 hours. So it can be the same things that you do with cows and heifers can have dramatically different results in the animal and then how it affects that whole calving process going forward. So yeah, they also isolate more. And again, part of that is new environment. A lot of times exposure to new animals in that pen. So they isolate earlier and they isolate farther away than cows do. Um, and so that again speaks to pen stocking density and how you manage that and how you manage that with a high percentage of heifers coming in versus cows.
That's interesting that there's that much difference.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I had never done before, but made sense to me when I saw it in the research is um, having a companion animal with heifers can really help reduce their stress because heifers are usually raised together in groups. So moving them into a group of cows by themselves really disrupts that whole social status. They tend to be pretty submissive, so they get knocked around a bit for a while and they go off feed for a while. And so how we do that is really important. And if we move them with a companion animal or a group of animals, moving them with a group is super challenging from a space standpoint, but moving them with a companion is more doable in a lot of operations, but it significantly reduces stress, helps them be restless, oops, less restless through the calving process, stay on feed better. And it seems like a pretty simple thing to really help the process. And again, it's what we do with if a woman is giving birth, she has a partner come in and sit with her through the process, and it's not for any medical reasons. It's just an emotional support person to be with them and reduce stress. But we haven't really thought about that with cattle until just recently.
Yeah, I like that the other point that you brought up during the webinar when we were talking about mitigating stress was the time of movement and how it affects aggression from older cows. You want to talk about that? Because I wrote that down because I thought I've never heard that before. So,
Yeah, so it's when we do it is really impactful. Probably the worst time to do it, we'll just start there, is post calving. So if you can keep heifers segregated all the way to calving, it makes that process a little easier. But then you throw them in with a group of cows post calving, and it's incredibly stressful for them, and that impacts their entire lactation, right? So they tend to be less aggressive at the feed bunk and um, they really struggle in that new environment. So the earlier we can introduce them to older cows, the better, and the fewer pen changes, the better. Um, but whenever we do it is going to be a little bit stressful. So for heifers, I would very much avoid that just-in-time calving movement if possible, and move them in with at least one companion animal into a group of cows as early in the pre-calving process as possible. It lets them get used to competing at the feed bunk, being around older cows. Um, it keeps that stress lower than through that really important time of that calving process. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Walt?
well, I had in here also you were talking about heifers that are moved in the morning are exposed to more aggression
Oh,
from
yes.
older cows than those moved in the evening.
Yep. I thought that was a really cool bit of research, and there's a fair bit of data that really supports that. Cows tend to be more aggressive to heifers that are moved in to their pens in the morning, which again was something that I learned as I prepared for the webinar in the past. So that was new information for me, but really, I thought that's something that most everyone can find a way to implement. Right? That's an easy thing that you can do that reduces stress for the animal and improves profit one way or another for people is just to move them later in the evening when cows are just getting more settled down and ready to nest down and rest for the night. They're a lot less aggressive. But apparently, when they get up in the morning, they're a little moodier and provide some more challenges to the
Who
heifers.
isn't a little grouchy in the morning?
That's,
They haven't had their coffee yet, so
that's
I guess, Phil, had you heard that before with moving
no, I
cattle?
not. Nope.
Okay.
That's new. That's new news to me from Howard. So in the environment, getting animals ready to calve are what are some of the things that producers could do? Like put up barriers to separate them off to the side, or what are some of the things you've seen be successful there?
yeah. So um, there's no perfect calving environment again. There's pros and cons for everything. So individual calving pens are really nice for biosecurity reasons. You've only got one cow's pathogens for that calf to be exposed to. It's less stressful in some ways for cows because they like to be isolated. Um, and it's easier if you need to assist. It's safer to assist. when there's not a group of cows running around that are being fairly aggressive with a calf being born. The challenges with individual pens, though, is then they're socially isolated again. So for heifers, individual pens can be really stressful unless you have, again, companion animals in adjoining pens that help reduce that stress. And it's also far more expensive to manage individual pens. In group pens, um, animals can do more normal social behaviors, but we have to really control for stocking density. And minimum space is 50 square feet per animal, which very few places that I've been on meet the minimum space. And ideal space for animals to have really reduced stress during calving is over 100 feet, 100 square feet per animal, which is really challenging to try and meet in a facility. And especially if you're moving in groups of animals or companion animals, that increases density then. So there's conflicting things that are helpful and not helpful. You can put in blinds in a group pen, and a percentage of animals will use that to calve. Um, but animals will also use it to isolate for other reasons. So it doesn't really help if some cow's gone into the blind just to hang out and be away from the other cows, and then a heifer's trying to calve, and then it's creating a more stressful space. Um, but I've seen people use really successfully have like individual pens around the edges of a group pen. And then if a heifer goes in to isolate, they can actually just close the gate, make sure that other cows don't come in and interrupt her while she's calving, and keep it a quieter space. The other challenges with blinds are whether or not to have visual. If you create visual barriers, it also creates ventilation barriers. And it also creates barriers for workers to see what's happening in the pen. So there's pros and cons to all of the things. Um, Animals like to have the visual barriers there. For the most part, they'll use them more frequently if it has a visual barrier, but it also provides some challenges from a management standpoint.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these practices, having your, whether that's family members or employees on board with, however you want to manage your maternity area is pretty key to this, right?
Yes.
Because it takes a lot of training for people to understand when does the calving process start and when I should or should not move those animals. Assisting in delivery, those are pretty major, I guess, pathways during the calving process that can make a pretty big impact on the animal.
Yep. Yep. And I think we do a great job of training people in the milking parlor. We'd never think of hiring someone who hasn't milked and throw them in and say, figure it out. Cow's been lactating for millions of years. This isn't hard. But with calving, we have people who are unprepared all the time, being exposed to trying to decide, should I assist? Should I not assist? Should I go in and check things? What should I check and when and how? So training is incredibly important, and training in the best management practice is a constantly evolving thing. So what we would say was best management practices 20 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 years ago has evolved. And if we haven't changed our training procedures for all of these things, then we're behind and we're not doing things in the best possible way. Um, I, th I think that's a key one. This is a great spot for technology as well, um, because going in and checking a cow during calving is not a stressful situation for that cow. She's used to people handling her in all different ways. She's been AI'd, she's been milked every day. She's used to people being in close proximity. For heifers, having people come in and check the position of the calf is really stressful, or check what's going on, and that makes them more restless and extends out the calving process and leads to a higher incidence of stillbirth and dystocia. Um, but if you have cameras in there, um, not only does that save us trips and time, but it also allows us to monitor without intervening and without creating stress for those animals. So we only go in when it's absolutely necessary and not just to check whether it's necessary.
Mhm.
A lot less banging doors, a lot less people and voices, and so we're just trying to keep a quiet, calm environment. Again, the same as you would in a hospital in a maternity ward. If you just think about the calving pen as a maternity ward and what you would want in that environment, I think it makes it easier.
And Howard, you did a lot of work with teaching people about safe assistance, the pulling force, timing, and that whole process. I just find it's fascinating the amount of pressure we actually put on that animal when we use force. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I found that fascinating too because as a former dairy producer, I did a lot of things wrong when I was that I was 100% sure I was helping. Right? I think that's the challenge with calving is no one goes in to unnecessarily put stress on an animal or to damage an animal, but um, it the the uterus is putting about 80 pounds of force and pushing that animal out. And pushing an animal out, the good part about pushing a calf out is it compresses the calf's body and protects it from the force of the uterine contractions. So the ribs are pressed down against the pelvis and you're really protecting the organs. When we're pulling the calf out, we stretch them out a lot more and it's much easier for those uterine contractions to do damage and it's much easier for us to do damage. One person pulling can pull with a couple of 100 pounds of force. So that's a pretty significant amount of force to be putting on those not completely calcified bones of that calf. And especially if the cervix hasn't completely dilated and prepared for that. But I think the one that you might be referring to is if we pull out the calf jack, calf jack, most calf jacks can go uh, anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds of force before they bend. And it's, I've been very amazed and astounded by how many places I've gone to where they've bent multiple calf jacks pulling out calves. It only takes uh, 300 or 400 pounds of force to break a femur in a calf, and that's the most calcified bone in their body. So those front legs, what you get if we pull too hard is just spiral fractures. So it just pulls the bone apart, literally. And Phil could speak to this much better than I can. I just read about it. He's
Yeah.
got far more experience with that. But those are fairly common during assisted deliveries and just not always diagnosed. Um, and I was on a farm actually where they had close to 10% of their calves in leg casts. And they said, yeah, a lot of our calves just break their legs as they're being born. And I thought, well, I don't think the calves are breaking their own legs. I think there's probably some assistance in that. So, Phil, maybe you can speak more to that.
No, that's true that you can break their legs when they're born like that. I think you're right. They're not going to break their own. It's because we interfered. Yeah.
Yep. So the less assistance, the better. And I think we tend to want to assist more with heifers because they take longer and they're more restless, and we want to help. And that's literally where we have to stand back more, is to allow that cervix to dilate fully and allow them the time to deliver. And the calf tells you when it's stressed. Most calves, when they're born, have their tongue out. So that's a pretty good barometer for their oxygenation. The tongue will turn a darker purple as the oxygen levels drop and their eye reflexes drop and other reflexes drop. So there's things that we can keep an eye on before we jump in to assist unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember talking to a dairyman once that told me he had more DOAs than he wanted, and he decided that they were interfering too much. That everybody thought they were doing the right thing, but he just stopped the interfering, and actually his DOA rate went down by doing less, not by doing more. That's a tough thing to learn when you're pulling calves. Is you don't want to go in too early, but you don't want to go in wait too long, and if you could have interfered, get a live calf. So
Yep. Yeah, it is. There's an art and a science to it. There's a lot of science to it. So important that people implement that, but it is also, um, I've worked with people that just do it on feel, and some of them are horrible at it and pull every calf, and kill a lot of them, and some of them are really, really talented at telling when that cow is worn out or that calf is in distress, and their gut intuition matches totally up with the science that we're putting on it. We were doing a study on a big farm out in California where we actually put on the same monitors that they put on babies when they're being born to monitor stress. And we put those on calves as they were being born. Um, and as the monitors were telling us that the calf was in distress, the guy that was monitoring or following it and just worked there all the time, 90% of the time he'd come up and he'd be like, I feel like it's probably time to intervene on this one. And we're like, wow, you're really good at this because his he's like, it just looks like they're ready to need help. And not many people can do that, but there is an art to it as well.
Yeah, so once we get that calf out and she's breathing, well, sometimes she's not breathing, right? So we have to do some things when she is born. And I know there's been things that we have done in the past that we probably shouldn't have done, and that at least I know of, that I've learned of. Do not hang the calf upside down, because that causes a lot of pressure on their lungs. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that calf care right after birth.
Yeah. An interesting fact that I learned that I did not know, uh, that I found after I had farmed again, and done things wrong for a long time, is 70% of calves that are stillborn still have a heartbeat, so they still can be revived. If they were down and not breathing for a few minutes, I just assumed they were gone and they got tossed in the dead pile. And I don't know how many calves I put in a dead pile that still had a beating heart and, could have been jump started there. The jump start is important because, like I say, a lot of people, I've seen some really, really good things that people do and some interesting choices that people make with newborn calves that aren't breathing. But the stimulus to breathe is a temperature change, number one. So most of that is sensed in the face. So cold water in the face, and especially like in the forehead area, will stimulate a gasp. And it's super important that that first breath be a gasp because the lungs are filled with amniotic fluid that contains surfactant, and surfactant is what allows the lungs to expand and not collapse, when the calves exhale. So we need that gasp to occur because it pulls that surfactant across the lung tissue, pulls the amniotic fluid across the lung tissue and just smothers the lung tissue with surfactant. It just coats the lung tissue with surfactant as that happens. So the bigger the gasp, the better off that calf is at first. If you've seen newborn calves that you come into that are breathing, but it sounds like they have pneumonia because they're just kind of rattling when they breathe, it's because they didn't get that first gasp really well and they still have some fluid in their lungs. And it's a lot harder to clear it after that. So that affects them as well. So getting that first gasp is important. Like I say, people will hang them upside down to drain the fluid out of their lungs. Number one, that doesn't drain the fluid out of their lungs. And number two, like you said, it compresses all their digestive organs against the diaphragm, and it makes it really hard to gasp, if you've got that extra pressure there, because a gasp is like 10 times the force of a normal breath. So it's
Yeah.
hard work for that calf to do that gasp. So cold air, and then there's, stimulus like neural stimulus you can do with the vagal nerve in the chest, like rubbing the chest, or in the nostril, which is where I always say use your little finger to tickle their nostril because a lot of times people will use straw, which also works, to cause that gasp, but it kind of you think you're causing them to like sneeze, but you're really just making them gasp. Um, but then I walked in on a farm one time where the farm worker had a piece of straw that was literally like a 7-inch twig that he was ramming up in their nostril, and I was like, oh my gosh, like we're stimulating their brain stem instead of their nostril there. But so I try and be really careful about the recommendations I give out on farm for those things. But yeah, I've seen a lot of people hang calves upside down. My favorite was a place that I went to where, calves that weren't breathing, they wrapped them in a big black blanket like a taco, and then someone grabbed either end and they swung them around like a carnival ride, which I'm not sure whether or not that was effective, but it was really fascinating thing to watch.
I know when you do turn them upside down, fluid does come out of their nostrils, but it's coming out of their stomach, not out of their trachea. So
Yep,
you're really draining what you think you're draining.
exactly.
So what about the Madigan squeeze technique? Is that something that's useful?
Yes, surprisingly, I can't give you all the physiological reasons why it works, but maybe you can, Bill. But for calves that are born that are not thriving well, and it works with foals or other lambs, other things as well. If they're just not thriving and not doing well, taking a long time to get sternal, a long time to stand, you can use what they call the Madigan technique, which is basically to wrap a rope or some kind of fabric around their chest and abdomen tightly for anywhere from a minute to a few minutes until they completely relax is what the recommendations I've seen, and then release it. And it it changes blood flow dynamics, I think, is
Uh-huh.
what's happening in there, and it helps stimulate blood flow to the right regions and get them functioning better again.
Yeah, very good.
Well, we
But
brought
it
up a lot of good practical strategies. Is there anything else you want to conclude with, Howard, as we kind of close out the podcast here?
um, yeah, I would just say in general, the three things to focus on. Well, we'll see if I come up with three things. I'm just making this up as I go, Jen. Um, is to try and be really intentional about minimizing stress for the heifer, whether it's pen moves, timing of those pen moves, how we're how we're interacting with them, what the environment is around them during calving. If we're, like running into to clean out bedding with a skid steer loader while animals are calving is probably not the ideal time to do that in a group pen. Um, but being really intentional about reducing stress, reducing noise, reducing things that cause them problems, and to acclimate them to things ahead of time, acclimate them to being around older animals, acclimate them to the milking parlor. If they go through the milking parlor and you run them through before calving, don't just run them through, but actually like handle them as they come through. You don't want to stimulate milk letdown, but you do want to get them used to having the milking machine put under their mammary gland and someone touching their mammary gland while they're in there and being handled and worked through so that isn't such a stressful experience post calving. Um, Training people, everyone that's around the calving pen, like you said, um, everyone that comes in there needs to be really well trained and then observed as they're doing it, the same as you would do in a milking parlor for people that are milking because the losses are similar. Um, and then just reviewing those practices every few years, just because they're working for you doesn't mean we can't again make improvements as we learn new things and as new technologies become available or the calving. There's different types of calving aids that you can use that tell you when a cow is starting to calve, that we've used, and they're really helpful for knowing when a cow is starting into stage one labor and um, or depending on the technology you're using, stage one or stage two, and then you have a better idea of how long cows have been in labor or heifers have been in labor and um, where there's problems or where there's not. So, using the technologies that make sense, um, investing investing in those resources and those spaces, because as you're building facilities, we're trying to be as efficient as possible and think about how can we minimize the cost of building that and building a space that has 100 square feet per animal does not seem cost effective. But if it saves you a couple of $100,000 a year over time, that is super cost effective, then it's a really worthwhile investment. So thinking about the long-term investments on this. Last thing I want to say too is these are really long-term impacts. So that really stressful delivery that could have been prevented um, doesn't just impact that cow and that calf, and it does. It impacts that cow through the entire lactation, or that heifer through her entire first lactation. It also impacts that calf throughout their life. That high cortisol level prenatally impacts how they respond to stress for the rest of their life, and it impacts their offspring as well. So our cost estimates are probably really low because these are multi-generational impacts of the decisions that we're making in the moment. Those are really important to think about as you're making this decision. It's not just impacting that day and that moment, but it's impacting that entire lactation for that heifer and in the entire lifetime for that calf, as well as her offspring's responses. So these are huge, huge impacts from the decisions that we make. And as Phil said, the management decisions that you make to just stand back a little more and do things based more on science than that feeling that, or that efficiency that I need to get into milk, so I'm going to pull these calves now, can really dramatically change the incidence of dystocia and stillbirth on a farm. Worked with a farm that had over 25% incidence of stillbirth on their farm, changed their practices, immediately went down to less than 3%. So it wasn't bad breeding decisions, it wasn't bad facilities, it was just management choices and being more intentional about how they approached calving.
Very good.
I'll shut up
Yeah.
now. I need
It's okay. No, I could listen to that all for more than 1 hour, right, Howard?
Right.
So appreciate the information that you've given us here today. I think you gave us a lot of practical strategies that we can implement, things that we can take home and hopefully be cost effective to our producers. Just thinking about those little things like being patient and looking at timing and employee management and training. Those are all things that, yes, we do, but just being mindful of those things as we go through our day-to-day practices. So appreciate all the insight on that. We did do a webinar with you a few weeks ago, so we'll include that in our show notes if people want to learn more and kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the things we talked about here today. But certainly appreciate you being on here. And Phil, as always, I appreciate you being on the podcast as well.
Well, thank you. I love the way you organize these, Jen. You do a great job.
All right.
Yes, thanks, Jen. Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thanks for listening to Dairy News and Views from ISU. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and keep making a difference in the dairy industry.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.